They say you only hear it before dawn. That peculiar echo in Exeter's quad, half laugh, half lament, like something from a pantomime or a parable. I heard it once, years ago, before I had cause to remember such things. A sound too ridiculous to be real, and yet too mournful to be anything else. It had rained that night, a cold, clean rain that leaves everything glistening, even the stone faces of long-dead benefactors carved into college walls. I'd gone walking, as I often did, when sleep felt like a task rather than a comfort, and had ended up, as I often did, outside the White Horse. It was barely 6. No one sensible would have been out. I ordered a pint regardless, not to drink it, but to mark the time. The barmaid was too polite to say anything, though she did raise an eyebrow at the drizzle collecting on my shoulders. That pub has known stranger things. Lewis joined me some 20 minutes later, bearing a copy of the Oxford Mail folded to page 5. He didn't sit, just stood, his expression carefully neutral, and laid the paper down in front of me. I remember the smell. Damp newsprint, cold lager, and the faint ghost of pipe smoke from an old man 2 stools down. The headline was unobtrusive, no byline, no photograph, just a few inches of text beneath the horoscopes and an article about parking violations on Banbury Road. Senior Don dies in study. Exeter College mourns philosopher Dr. Ian Rook, 63. I didn't touch the pint, I rarely do at that hour. Rook, I hadn't seen him in some years, but he was the sort one remembered. Lean, angular, with a voice like a cello, played one string too tight. He had lectured on logic and metaphysics, though his real talent had always been in ambiguity. He once told me that the truth was just a well-arranged contradiction. We disagreed, of course. Politely. Lewis waited for me to say something. I said only that I disliked coincidences. He frowned. There weren't any, he said. The man had collapsed over his desk. Natural causes. Heart, possibly stress, possibly guilt, possibly just time. Catching up with a man who'd dared think himself cleverer than it. Still, I found myself walking toward Exeter not long after. The rain had stopped, leaving the flagstones gleaming like polished bone. The quad was empty, as it often is at such hours, but I paused by the chapel anyway, as if something might linger there. A thought, perhaps, a fragment of a song. The past wears strange coats, and then I heard it. Soft at first, absurd in the way only something ancient can be. A bray, not quite animal, not quite human. Drawn out like a laugh remembered from a nightmare. It came from beneath the stones, or so it seemed, echoed through the archways, lingered near the sundial. I turned, saw nothing. No trick of wind, no theatrical student prank, just that sound, low and implausible. It didn't frighten me, but it stayed with me even after I stepped into the stairwell and up to the porter's desk. McGrath was there, reading a worn novel, spine cracked and pages swollen with age. He looked up and said he'd been expecting someone. He didn't tell me. He never did. He only gestured toward the senior common room and told me Dr. Rook's rooms were locked now, of course, but I could look in on the others if I liked. They were all a bit shaken, he said. Especially Dr. Fain. I said nothing. There's a kind of grief that needs no announcement. Just as there's a kind of guilt that hides not in action, but in silence. Outside, the quad held its breath. A pigeon fluttered across the tiles, then stopped short, as if listening too. The braying had stopped, but the echo hadn't. There is a hush particular to college breakfasts, not silence exactly, but the sort of restraint one hears in the turning of thin newspaper pages and the cautious clink of silverware against porcelain. No one laughs at that hour. Jokes are allowed, of course, but only if they are quiet, bitter, or French. I took my seat at the far end of the senior common room, not so much invited as tolerated. The scent of burned toast and wet wool hovered above the mahogany buffet like a memory no one wished to claim. Someone, somewhere, had opened a window, and a thin draught teased its way across the backs of the necks present, as if encouraging a confession none would offer. Dr. Fain was already there, straight-backed and unreadable, stirring her tea with a concentration that seemed theatrical. Her scarf was lilac, knotted precisely, and gave off a faint trace of something floral and unfamiliar. Not perfume, I thought, but something older, like the paper sachets left in drawers by women who no longer expect visitors. She met my gaze once and then looked away, which I considered both intelligent and unwise. Across the table, Professor Latchbury muttered something to the bursar about parking. The bursar nodded, but his eyes were on the blackboard behind me. I turned to see what held his attention and found a fragment of text chalked there, still legible in the morning dim. Nil igitur mors est ad nos, an echo of Lucretius, though clipped, and badly so. Rook's hand, I presumed. His handwriting had always looked more like a wound than a style. Lewis had said there was no note. I wondered if this was meant to be one. If so, it was either badly chosen or meant to be misread. Death is nothing to us, it translates. A lie philosophers tell to help them sleep. The toast was dry. The eggs resembled the inner thoughts of bureaucrats, grey, lukewarm, and resolutely bland. I declined both. Instead, I stirred the coffee I hadn't touched and watched them all. A student entered briefly and asked for Dr. Rook's forwarding address. The porter at the door hesitated a moment too long, then offered a muttered answer about the family. The student blinked, then turned and walked out. The room did not resume its previous rhythm. It simply absorbed the pause like Oxford always does. Fain finally spoke, almost to herself, noting that Rook had been particularly unsettled of late. She said it as one might comment on the state of the weather in Turin, faintly concerned, yet fundamentally detached. I asked what form his unease had taken. She hesitated just long enough to be noticed, then replied. There had been letters. She did not elaborate. I asked about the crossword, left unfinished on his desk. She arched an eyebrow. Rook always left them unfinished, she said. He disliked answers. I made a mental note of that. There is a kind of absence you can feel in a room. Not the simple lack of a body, but the hole left by a mind once sharp enough to wound. Rook's presence still hung there, not mourned but appraised. Academic death always invites a kind of inventory. I stood, murmured something perfunctory, and stepped toward the blackboard. The Latin, now in full light, revealed a ghost line beneath it, partially erased, perhaps once a longer quote, perhaps not. Only one word remained legible, barely, frustra. In vain. The error was deliberate, I was certain now, not a misquote, but a misdirection. The way one changes a single clue in a crossword to lead the solver astray. I had the sensation, faint, like distant bells, that this was a puzzle built to punish the one who tried to complete it. Outside, the quad remained wet, though the rain had stopped. A gardener crouched by the edge of a flower bed, pulling weeds that were indistinguishable from the plants they surrounded. He worked quietly, as if afraid to disturb the stones. I glanced once more through the leaded windows of the hall. They were eating again. Life, like toast, persists. But I couldn't help wondering why Rook had chosen that phrase for his final blackboard, or if he'd chosen it at all. Perhaps it had been written for him. The rooms were smaller than I remembered. That often happens. Memory enlarges things we never properly inhabited. Rook's study sat above the cloisters, just far enough from the quad to avoid its laughter, just near enough to hear its secrets when it fell silent. The porter unlocked the door with the kind of solemnity reserved for ceremonial vaults, then left me alone with the dust. I didn't turn on the lights at first. There was something to be gleaned in the way shadows arranged themselves across bookshelves. A man's habits linger in the architecture of his disorder. Books everywhere, of course, not stacked, not chaotic, but curated. Ancient spines rubbed bare with handling, margins thick with battles. The rooms smelled of old leather, pipe tobacco, and faintly vinegar, as though something preserved had recently soured. I thought of pickled minds, which is the kind of thought one ought not speak aloud, even to oneself. His desk faced the window, not the courtyard, the sky. That was deliberate. Rook had always been more interested in abstraction than consequence. On the blotter sat an open notebook, its left-hand page smudged where the ink hadn't dried before he slumped. A circle drawn with slow insistence, beneath it a single line. If guilt has geometry, let it be curved. On the right-hand side, more conventional scribbling, the bones of a paper on paradox and agency, inked in a hand both urgent and distracted. A phrase repeated, the ethics of omission. And below that, scratched faintly into the paper, as if by afterthought or tremor. Marchant? I knew the name. Everyone did, if they'd stayed long enough. Once a fellow here, bright, sardonic. Too bright, some said. Too sardonic, said others. He'd left the college in the late 70s, quietly and quickly, after what the Dons never called a scandal. Just a misunderstanding, they said, a misalignment of interests, the sort of euphemism only an Oxford committee could weaponize. On the shelf beside the desk was a small silver frame, turned inward away from the chair. Curious? I picked it up. Inside, a photograph, one of those official college affairs, poorly lit and professionally joyless. Rook stood at the center, unsmiling, one hand tucked into his gown. To his right, barely visible, the figure I took to be Marchant. But someone had obscured the face with the point of a pen, not scribbled out, just blotted, over and over, as if one could erase a memory by bruising its image. The blot reminded me of something else. On the floor beneath the desk, a page torn in half. A page from the Observer, I think. The crossword is half intact, clues filled in with the same angular hand. One caught my eye, 7 down. Echo of guilt, faint and foolish, 5. The answer scrawled beside it, ason, not a word, not quite, but close to assonance, I supposed, and assonant, echoes that almost rhyme, but never do. A kind of linguistic guilt. It was wrong, of course, but only deliberately, the sort of clue Rook would leave to himself, or to someone who knew how he thought. I folded the scrap and put it in my coat pocket. Not evidence? Not yet. On the far shelf, something is out of place. A gap in the row of monographs where one book had clearly been removed recently. Dust disturbed, edges clean. I checked the nearby titles, Ethics, Ancient Paradoxes, and Legal Theory. All of Rook's terrain, but the missing volume was De Officiis, Cicero on Duties, a moral text disguised as a political one, or perhaps the other way round. I stepped back, let my gaze drift. The window held a smear of bird droppings across its corner, a tree bent oddly in the distance, straining towards something unseeable. The desk chair bore a single indentation, like a body unwilling to leave, a knock at the open door. Lewis, in his usual state of polite confusion, informed me that Workmen had uncovered something beneath the quad during routine maintenance. Bricks, he said, charred, possibly very old, possibly something else. I said I'd be down shortly. I turned once more to the blackened face in the photograph and wondered, what had Marchant done? or failed to do? And why was Rook drawing circles in ink on the morning of his death? Not everything begins with action. Sometimes it begins with absence. There is a particular silence that lives in archives. Not the absence of noise, but its containment, as if sound itself had been catalogued, labelled, and placed gently in a drawer alongside old fellowship rosters and crumbling matriculation notices. I've always found comfort there, not in the dust or the scent of yellowing glue, but in the knowledge that even the forgotten are preserved, if not remembered, then at least recorded. The Exeter archive sat above the Fellows' Library, tucked behind a door that stuck slightly in the rain. A modest plaque read Archivum Collegi Exoniensis, the Latin lending it a gravity that far outweighed the room's size. It was not grand, it did not try to be, but it kept its secrets the way the river keeps its depth, without ceremony. I found Quentin Stoyle halfway through a sandwich, which he wrapped with the kind of apology only academics manage, something between a sigh and an anecdote. He'd been assistant archivist for over 20 years, though no one ever recalled when he'd been promoted from assistant to anything else. He wore gloves, though not consistently, and had the look of a man who'd once been loved by a reader of medieval poetry and never quite recovered. He gestured vaguely toward a pile of requests, mostly genealogical queries from Canadians hoping to prove their great-grandfathers had drunk at Hall. Then, as if remembering I wasn't there for that sort of history, he motioned me to a chair and asked what I was chasing. I told him I was looking for anything Dr. Rook had requested recently. Privately, not officially. Letters, college records, ephemera. The sort of paper trail left not by curiosity, but by guilt. He blinked, then nodded, slowly, as if confirming something to himself. Yes, he said. There had been something odd. 3 weeks ago, Rook had come in asking after a sealed correspondence file, restricted, but not classified. Dons from the early 70s. He hadn't given a reason, and Stoyle hadn't asked, though he noticed the way Rook's hands had trembled slightly when he signed the ledger. An old file marked confidential. Originated in 1973. The same year, Theo Marchant had disappeared from the college. The file, Stoyle said, had never gone missing. But it had been misfiled more than once, always under different names, as though it had tried, over the years, to disappear. A ghost story, he smiled. Every archive has one. He handed me a thin folder with frayed corners, a typewritten note at the front, privileged correspondence regarding fellowship matters, Lent term, 1973. Below are 4 names, Rook's among them, Marchant's too. I read slowly. Phrases floated up from the page like reluctant confessions. Questionable conduct. Internal review unnecessary. Handled internally. No formal record recommended. There had been a 5th name, redacted. Not with ink, but by erasure. The kind done with a scalpel, not a pen. The sentence simply ended mid-thought, like a man interrupted before he could confess. I ran my thumb over the space where words had once lived. There's a texture to omission that even silence can't smooth over. On the back of the last page, someone had written a note in pencil, Asinus in quadrato. I blinked, Latin again, a donkey in the square. Or the quad, a joke, a code, a warning? Stoyle shrugged when I showed him. Rook had laughed when he'd read it, he said. Not a real laugh, the kind of sound you make when you've heard your own death foretold in a nursery rhyme. I asked if the file had been copied. Stoyle shook his head. No scanner, no permission. Rook had sat with it, read every page twice, took no notes, just stared at it. Then left, I thanked him and turned to go, but stopped as he called after me, softly, almost as an afterthought. "The donkey," he said. "It's not the first time. People say they've heard it before. Years ago, under the paving." He smiled faintly. Of course, ghosts have better things to do. Outside, the sky had paled to something sullen. The stones beneath my feet seemed newly ancient, as though they remembered what the humans above them tried so hard to forget. The quad was empty, but not silent. Somewhere beneath the library a file lay closed, but not finished. There are rooms in Oxford where time does not pass so much as settle. Softly, like dust on a windowsill, no one dares to clean. The studio in the northeast turret of Exeter was one such room, not part of any official plan. A wartime necessity, someone had once said. It had survived both bombs and budget committees. No one taught there, but someone painted. I found her seated cross-legged on the floor, brushes strewn like casualties around her. The air smelled of turpentine and something else. Beeswax, perhaps, or regret. The canvas before her was large, unwieldy, and turned away from me, as if what it showed was not ready to be seen. She didn't look up when I entered, just dipped a fine-tipped brush into a little dish of grey and added the smallest line to the corner of what might have been a stone arch. Her name was Lila Merrow, postgraduate. Art history with a grant from somewhere I could never afford to drink. She'd once posed for a mural now locked in the college's archive basement, or so I'd been told. There were whispers that Rook had taken an interest in her work. Whether academic or otherwise, no one seemed to know, or admit knowing. I asked her if she knew him well. She kept painting. "Well is a difficult word," she said. "He was kind to me once, the sort of kind that makes you nervous." I waited. She didn't elaborate. There was a table to one side, covered in photographs, mostly quadrangles, cloisters, formal gardens caught in the blue-grey fog of early morning. Architectural, melancholy. A few were annotated in soft pencil, too sharp, wrong rhythm, not empty enough. I picked up one. A shot of the inner quad just before sunrise. The paving stones were wet, the shadow of the chapel stretching like a question no one wanted to answer. She noticed. "That was taken 3 days before he died," she said. I was trying to catch the shape of the quiet. She had a way of speaking that made you listen twice, as though the second time would reveal something the first had only hinted at. I turned my attention to a canvas leaning near the radiator, half finished or half erased. A female figure, indistinct, stood in a corridor facing away. The brushwork was careful, hesitant. The light, if it could be called that, fell sideways, like memory intruding. I asked who she was. "No one," she said, "or maybe just me." Not looking. There was a pause, the kind that settles like snow. I asked if Dr. Rook had ever raised his voice. She thought for a moment. "Only once. When someone mentioned Marchant. Then he went very quiet and asked me to leave the room. I asked what she'd been doing there. Sketching. He wanted me to understand stillness," she said, "and silence. That they weren't the same." She picked up a charcoal stick and ran it lightly over a scrap of canvas, then paused. "He used to say that philosophy is just fear with better shoes," she added. I never knew if that was original. I stepped to the easel, finally, and looked at the canvas she'd been working on. The scene was familiar. The Exeter quad, rendered in pale blues and greys, nearly translucent. No people. Just stones, wet with a kind of implied weeping. And there, barely visible beneath one arch, a strange smudge, a dark figure, poorly defined. At first glance it looked like a cloak, then a tail, I asked. "It's a donkey," she said, without turning. Or maybe just the shadow of one. Sometimes I paint things before I notice them. She smiled then, not kindly, not unkindly, just as someone who's forgotten which version of the story she believes. I left the studio not long after. The stairs creaked as I descended, old timber groaning beneath boots meant for more honest roads. Outside, the wind had shifted. The sky was the colour of lead paper, soaked in old tea. In my pocket, the photograph of the quad weighed more than it should have. The shadow in the archway had not been there before. Or perhaps I had simply not looked long enough. There is something faintly cruel about music in sacred spaces. Not the music itself, never that, but the way it lingers long after the singers have left, trailing behind like a silk scarf dropped in a corridor. I've always felt hymns betray more than they comfort, especially in Oxford, where the acoustics are built not for consolation but for confession. It was evensong at Exeter, a Tuesday. The choir was leaner than usual, undergraduates still dazed by terms, griefs and distractions. I had no business being there. I wasn't invited nor expected. But something about the light in the chapel windows had drawn me in, that and the scent, beeswax and damp hymnals. The place smelled like the margins of a prayer. I sat in the back, as I always did. The chapel's ceiling arched like a question no one wanted answered. Stained glass filtered the dusk into pale bruises on stone. The boy soprano, too young to understand what he was singing, and too old not to feel it, carried the descant with a sort of aching purity that made the throat constrict. The words, I realized, were altered, not dramatically, just a single line tucked near the end of the second verse, ad pacem dolorum silentium, where it had once been ad lucem per veritatem. Peace through sorrow's silence rather than light through truth, a subtle substitution, but deliberate. I glanced at the hymnal. The printed text was unchanged, so this was either a recent revision or an old one revived. A rephrasing of meaning, the sort of thing Rook might have argued over, pedantically, precisely, until someone relented just to make him go away. After the service, I drifted toward the chapel's north aisle, letting the others file out. They murmured quietly, the way dons always do when unsure if tradition has been broken or merely bent. Near the organ, a stack of hymn books sat slightly askew. I took the top one and flipped to the index. A note in the margin, penciled with a scholar's care, marked the hymn as a modified Marchant version, revised. 1973. That name again, ghosts accumulating in corners. Lewis found me half an hour later, hunched over a port decanter in the senior common room, tracing the etched lines on the glass like they might spell something I'd missed. He'd found something, or rather, something had found him. A hymn book was returned anonymously to the porter's lodge. Inside, an inscription on the inner flyleaf, Theo Marchant, Michaelmas, 1972. Veritas in Cantu. Truth in song. I stared at the phrase longer than I should have. The Latin was unambiguous, but truth has its own inflections, and I wondered whose truth had been sung that evening. We sat in silence a while. The fire hissed softly. Outside, wind rattled a sash that had never quite shut properly. I said nothing. Lewis, perhaps sensing I needed it, also said nothing. That's one of his gifts. He doesn't press, just waits. Later, I wandered through the corridor behind the dining hall, where portraits of former masters stared down with expressions of permanent verdict. One of them, a bearded man with eyes too sharp to belong to the living, bore a name I didn't recognize. I leaned in. The plaque had been scratched at, not vandalized, corrected. Above the door to the music room I paused. I remembered something. Faint, fragmentary, a dispute in the early 70s, a vote over the rewriting of the college anthem, theology clashing with philosophy. One wanted absolution, the other accuracy. Rook had sided with Marchant, or against him. The records were unclear. But the hymn, I now knew, had never been officially changed, and yet tonight it had been sung differently. I stood for a long time at that threshold, unsure whether to enter or retreat. In the end, I did neither. Just listened. Somewhere, down a passage too narrow to justify its own existence, someone was humming. 3 notes, then silence. It arrived folded into itself as though embarrassed to be opened. Lewis handed it to me in the cloisters just past noon, when the sun had the arrogance to shine despite the undertones of a slow collapse beneath the stone. He hadn't read it. Said he'd found it in the porter's incident tray, misplaced between a plumbing invoice and an alumni dinner RSVP. No envelope, no salutation, just a name at the end, Marchant. The letter was typewritten, but only just. The ribbon had begun to fray, leaving certain words ghosted or blurred, like a conscience, trying to withhold its verdict. I read it once in silence, then again. I folded it carefully and told Lewis we'd speak later. In my room, I laid it beside my own copy. The same letter, I thought, until I saw it wasn't. Not quite. The phrasing was identical for most of the first paragraph, a sort of intellectual apology, structured like a philosophical proof, then a deviation, a word inserted here. A clause was omitted there. One version pleaded, the other accused. One ended with, I never meant for it to happen. The other with, you knew exactly what you were doing. 2 letters, 1 writer, but different ghosts. I returned to Rook's study late that afternoon. The smell had settled, not quite gone, but less obtrusive, like guilt after confession. I opened his top drawer, empty, the drawer below it also empty, but the third, shallow, fitted for nothing in particular, held a single slip of paper, half torn. The header read, Bodleian Copying Services, a receipt dated 2 weeks prior. Item, typed document, 2 versions. Photocopies, X2. He had copied them both, but sent only 1. Which? The question needled. In the logic of guilt, the version one sends is the one cannot carry. Outside in the quad, someone was laughing. A sharp, echoing sound, too loud for the time of day, too misplaced for the college's grief. Laughter always sits oddly among stone. It doesn't settle, it ricochets. And in Oxford, it always carries the undertone of mockery, even when unmeant. I returned to my desk, laid the 2 letters side by side, noticed that in one, the signature was slightly off-center, the other dead straight. A subtle misalignment, but telling? A man in distress does not center his name. He staggers into it. The uneven one, then, was the true original. The cleaner version had been corrected, sanitized, rewritten for the college secretary. But it wasn't only the layout. A single sentence had been altered, just one, but it hung in my mind like smoke in an enclosed room. You remember what we buried that night. The second version changed it to, you remember what we agreed not to speak of. A burial versus a silence. I stepped out into the corridor, the walls cooler now, evening beginning to etch itself into the mortar. There's something about old buildings, the way they seem to watch you leave, as though they know you'll be back, and less whole each time. In the porter's lodge, I asked for the logbook. McGrath, who rarely refused anything so long as it didn't involve formality, handed it over with a shrug. The entry for last Friday, early morning, an unnamed visitor. Just, gentleman, no appointment, asked after Dr. Rook. Left no message. Time recorded 6:23 a.m. the same morning Rook died. McGrath looked sheepish when I pressed him. Tall man, grey coat, didn't say much. Left by the tailgate, walked slowly, as if he knew where the cracks in the paving were. Marchant, no one had seen him in decades. Rumour held he'd left for Rome, or Sussex, or somewhere with fewer mirrors. But a man can return for many reasons. Closure, revenge, or just to hear the truth misquoted one last time. I returned home and poured a whiskey I didn't drink. The letters sat on my desk like twin verdicts from a court that had never convened. Outside, the wind changed. One letter forgives, the other remembers. Some things arrive without ceremony. A knock that's not a knock, a slip of paper beneath a door, a photograph that shouldn't exist anymore. It was late, though not by my standards, the sort of hour when Exeter's quads empty into themselves and the walls seem to whisper in Latin. The envelope was thin, unsealed, and lay gently on the carpet like a calling card. No handwriting, no initials. Inside, a single photocopy, grainy, almost greyed out with age, but clear enough. I knew the image. The college mural. Commissioned in 1972, painted in haste, and quietly removed a decade later when someone complained it was anachronistically intimate. Rook stood in the centre, as he had always insisted, flanked by two others, their shoulders slightly turned inward, as if they were sharing something not meant to be heard. I remembered the artist, an American, I think, fond of symbolism and poor with proportion. The faces were right, but the eyes had always been too honest. The version I remembered from the archives showed Marchant at Rook's side, hand on a lead, a leash, held casually, like a joke. The donkey, crouched beside them, painted with exaggerated ears and a knowing stare. At the time, it had been dismissed as student whimsy, nothing more. Except now, in this version, the leash was gone, not painted out, retouched, a smudge of tone and shadow where once there had been rope. I held the paper to the desk lamp, tilted it this way and that. The alteration was amateur, recent, a protest against implication, or a revision made too late. I'd seen this before, in witness statements, in committee minutes. The hand that edits is often more revealing than the one that composes. At the bottom of the copy, faint but legible, someone had typed a line in Courier, "He let it happen." I poured 2 fingers of the college port, let it breathe longer than necessary. I didn't want the taste, only the ritual. Rook had always pretended to dislike port, too ecclesiastical, he used to say, and yet I'd seen him accept it more than once, with the same ironic shrug one gives a punishment too long anticipated. I stared at the photograph, at the eyes, Marchant's in particular, slightly off to the left, as if watching something beyond the painter, or avoiding it. There was a stack of college newsletters on the sideboard, the sort no one reads but everyone keeps. I flicked through them absent-mindedly until a name caught the edge of my attention, a small paragraph buried between a wine-tasting invitation and the obituary of a bursar I'd once disliked, Theo Marchant. Listed as attending an alumni dinner 2 years ago, no photo, no quote, just the name, among many. I closed the newsletter gently as though the names inside might be disturbed by noise. Later that night, I retrieved the old photograph from the archive, the real one. Colour, faded but unretouched, held it beside the photocopy. The differences multiplied the longer I looked, not just the missing leash. A hand repositioned, the angle of Marchant's shoulders slightly revised. The donkey's eyes made duller. What had once been a smirk was now a blankness. Someone had tried to erase complicity by muting expression. I remembered a phrase from the 3rd letter, the one Rook never posted. I stood beside him, but I did not pull him back. It returned now like a bell heard through fog. In the far corner of the senior common room, a chessboard had been left mid-game. Black to move, rook in jeopardy. I wondered who had abandoned it. Perhaps the game had no clean ending, or perhaps one player simply stood up and walked away. Outside, rain had begun to fall softly, as if to soak the memories from the very stones. I stepped into the quad, photograph still in hand, and looked up at the old walls, their faces dark with weather and time. Some portraits hang in frames, others hide in photocopies. But the eyes remain. There are mistakes one corrects and those one conceals. And then there are the errors that sit quietly in plain view, not unnoticed, but unchallenged, because those who see them understand too well what it would cost to speak. I returned to Rook's rooms just before dusk, not out of necessity, but compulsion. Some spaces remain incomplete until you've stepped into them one final time. The windows were shut this time. The curtains were half drawn, as though some half-hearted attempt had been made to usher in privacy after the fact. But the air still held the faintest trace of ink and something else, the dry smell of chalk when it begins to fade under a damp cloth. It was the blackboard that pulled me, not the desk, not the papers, but that black slab on the wall left behind like the final phrase in a half-finished prayer. Nil igitur mors est ad nos. I'd seen it before and dismissed it. A misquote from Lucretius. Rook was too careful for that, even at the end. I had assumed lazily that it was a signal of fatigue or despair or carelessness. But despair, I found, rarely misquotes Latin. I studied the line again, this time slower. Something about the spacing, a single letter pressed too tightly as if forced, drew my eye. Not a misspelling, but a tremor in rhythm. I stepped closer, and there, faint beneath the chalk, a palimpsest line, part erased, still fighting its way through. I read it aloud under my breath, a sinus in quadrato, a donkey in the quad. It was absurd, juvenile, not philosophical at all, but the phrase had appeared elsewhere, in the Marchant file, scribbled in pencil, and in Lila Merrow's painting, implied in shadow. A motif repeated too often to be dismissed. I closed my eyes, retracing the sequence. Rook requests old correspondence, reads it, does not copy it, does not annotate it. Then writes a phrase from Lucretius, one that negates death. But beneath it he writes something else, a joke, a cipher, or a confession so veiled in irony it could pass as nothing at all. I opened his desk again, rifling with less reverence now. Most had been cleared, but tucked behind a pile of correspondence marked personal, do not forward, was a small notebook. Blue cover, thin, unlined pages, the kind students buy in their first year and forget by their third. Inside 3 lines, all in pencil, all in the same hand. Assess Bray when they remember. Marchant knew how to be silent, but I kept singing. I stared at the words longer than I should have. Tried to separate tone from meaning. Rook had always spoken in riddles, taught through them. But this wasn't a lesson. It was a rhythm. A failed attempt to match the pattern of guilt to the meter of thought. Below the lines a sketch, primitive, a square, inside a circle. At the circle's centre a dot, then the word quadrivium. I turned the page, expecting more, found nothing. Quadrivium, the ancient curriculum, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, the 4 paths to divine order, according to Plato. But in Oxford, it's also a corridor, a forgotten one behind the library, shaped like a square enclosing a well. I'd passed it a dozen times, never entering. I left the room without ceremony, the notebook in my coat. Outside, the college was settling into the evening. Chapel bells sounded wrong, as if someone had struck them from the side. Students moved in murmurs. their coats pulled tight, as though winter had returned mid-April. I found the quadrivium easily. It was smaller than I remembered, narrower. The kind of place built not to be noticed, but in the centre, where the paving shifted, unevenly underfoot, I saw it. A mark, chalk old, but not that old. A circle, a dot, a tail. Not a donkey, exactly, not anything, but something. I stood there a long while, listening. The quad was silent, but beneath it I imagined a sound, muffled, low, and almost comical in its sorrow. An error, in Latin or in the man. The scarf was the colour of dusk, not violet, not grey, but that indistinct shade between sadness and forgetfulness. I'd seen her wear it before, always knotted just so, as if its arrangement had been taught to her by someone long gone. She wore it again when I found her in the conservatory. A room too warm for the time of year, with palms that never stopped sweating and windows that refused to clear. She didn't turn when I entered. Just said my name as if summoning a memory she tried to keep buried beneath potting soil and academic routine. I asked if she'd read the letters. There was no need to specify which ones. She had. Twice, she said. Once as a scholar. Once as a coward. I watched her fingers folded in her lap. Still, too still, like someone trying not to reach, I told her I'd seen both versions, that Rook had sent only one, but someone had sent the other. The accusation. The one with no room left for interpretation. She didn't flinch. That's the thing about intelligent people. They practice their grief long before it's required. She said Marchant had written to her too, 2 weeks before Rook's death. The envelope had no return address. The postmark was blurred, as though rain had reached it before the box. Inside, a photocopy of the old photograph. The mural, and a note, typed, unsigned. Ask him what he heard that night. I asked if she had. She nodded, but he'd only said, I wasn't supposed to be there. Then he'd gone silent for a full minute. A silence she remembered not for its length, but for its weight. Then he'd said, there are some things you must live beside, like a river or a body. She paused then, as if the air had shifted. Then I think he wanted to confess, but not to me, to someone who already knew. I stepped closer, not out of pity, but pattern. The scarf shifted slightly, revealing a brooch, small, pewter, shaped like a quill. I'd seen it before in the mural, pinned to Marchant's robe. But here it looked different. Worn, I asked where she'd got it. She hesitated, then said, he gave it to me after he left. Said it belonged to a college that had forgotten how to speak. The conservatory felt suddenly too quiet. The plants listened. I asked her if Marchant had returned. She didn't answer directly. Just said, I left my window open the night Rook died. In January, I never do. There was a silence then, not hers or mine, but the room's. The glass panes trembled slightly in the wind, though none reached inside. I asked her what she thought he wanted. Forgiveness, she said, or revenge. I think he couldn't tell the difference anymore. I looked past her. To the garden beyond the misted windows. A figure stood by the sundial, motionless, back turned. But when I looked again, it was gone, or had never been. She asked me what I was going to do. I said I didn't know. Oxford has its own courts, and they rarely convene. She laughed then, not fully, just a breath with a shape. I stepped toward the door. Then they turned back. Asked her if she believed Rook had suffered. She looked down and said, he lived long enough to arrange his own absence. That's its own kind of pain. Outside, the sky was the colour of her scarf. The rain held back, but not for long. I walked slowly across the quad, the sound of my steps too loud against the stone. Somewhere behind me, the conservatory door clicked shut. Not slammed, just ended. It was McGrath who told me, though not directly. He never said things plainly. He was a porter of the old style, unflappable, unreadable, and likely privy to more confessions than the Dean of Chapel. I found him polishing the brass rail outside the hall, his cloth moving in slow, meditative circles, like a man remembering a song without words. He mentioned a visitor. I asked when, he said on Friday morning, before the rain, just after the baker's van. I asked who. He didn't know or said he didn't. Tall, grey coat, slight limp. Walked with a stick but didn't need it. Looked like someone who used to belong here but no longer wished to. He didn't give a name, McGrath said. Just asked for Dr. Rook. Then waited by the chapel for 20 minutes, maybe more. Then I walked the perimeter of the quad twice. Touched the sundial once, then left. Didn't say goodbye, just disappeared. I asked if he'd heard anything, a sound perhaps. McGrath paused, cloth still in his hand, said he heard a kind of laugh, but not laughter exactly, more like a bray, low, drawn out, echoed, like it didn't belong to the man who made it. He didn't think it was funny, neither did I. I walked the quad twice myself after that, not quickly. Just enough to measure the silence between stones. The sun had returned, but half-heartedly. The shadows of the arches stretched longer than they should have. I paused at the sundial. I looked down. There it was, a boot mark, faint, recent, pressed into the thin film of Oxford rain that hadn't yet dried. The toe angled toward the chapel, the heel half erased by a wind that no longer cared. I stepped inside. The chapel was empty, as it often was between services. The candles are unlit, the choir stalls are asleep, but the scent of the hymnals remained, parchment and dust and something faintly floral, like an old handkerchief. I sat where he might have sat, closed my eyes, and listened. There was no sound at first, just the breath of the building, but then, low, not quite human, not quite animal, I heard it again. Not with my ears, perhaps, but with the memory of having been somewhere a moment too late. A bray, of sorrow, of mockery, of both. I left the chapel and found myself walking back toward the archive without meaning to. The building was closed, but the outer corridor was open, cool, dim, lined with commemorative plaques no one had bothered to polish. I traced my fingers along the edge of one. Theophilus Marchant, 1968 to 1973. Fellow of Ethics and Metaphysics. The name had been re-engraved. I could see it now. The spacing is wrong. The serif is slightly altered. Someone had erased it. Then I rewrote it. History redrafted. I stepped outside again. The quad was still, but not empty. At the far corner, by the tree that never quite bloomed, a figure stood. Older, grey coat, head bowed. I didn't call out. Some meetings must remain unfinished. He turned eventually, walked away, not quickly, but with the confidence of someone who had already decided what not to say. I let him go. There are things that must be faced, but not all of them by me. Back in my rooms, I opened the crossword I'd been ignoring for days. 4 across, beast of burden with borrowed voice, 6. I didn't write the answer, I just circled the clue. Then poured a drink I didn't deserve and sat by the window watching the quad settle into itself again, the stones darker now as if they had swallowed the sound and wouldn't give it back. Somewhere beneath them, something had brayed, but no one was laughing. Dusk is the only hour Oxford understands. Morning arrives too optimistically, full of coffee and misplaced ambition. Night brings ceremony, cloaks, choir, Latin muttered through incense. But dusk is when the stones breathe, when the shadows remember their lines, when the quad, emptied of purpose, becomes what it has always been, a theatre for regrets. I stood beneath the old arch between the chapel and the library, the one where light splits into strips and makes you feel as though you've walked into an etching. Rain had come and gone, leaving a thin gloss on the paving. The students were indoors now. A few candles glimmered in upper windows. Silhouettes hunched over keyboards or old books, each unaware they were participants in something far older than them. I hadn't slept. Not well, at least. I'd sat by the fire with the crossword I couldn't finish, the port I didn't want, and the memory of a voice I hadn't heard in decades. Marchant was gone again. I knew that as surely as I knew how the story would be told later, that he had come to make peace, that he had come to confront, that he had come to bury or unbury whatever lay beneath the donkey's shadow, that he had, in the end, come simply to be seen. But not by me. I hadn't tried to stop him. There are silences that should not be broken twice. A breath of wind lifted something near the sundial, a page, perhaps, or a torn corner of someone's sermon. I moved toward it, bent down, a hymn leaflet, from the evensong the week before. I turned it over. A name penciled lightly at the corner, Gillian Fain. I hadn't seen her since that conversation in the conservatory. I hadn't expected to. People disappear in Oxford. Not literally, though sometimes even that. More often, they vanish politely, into research grants, sabbaticals, fellowships with long titles, and no return dates. Their presence recedes not in a bang, but in the careful absence of their name from the next term's committee list. I folded the paper once, then again, placed it in my coat pocket, not as evidence but as acknowledgement. There was still the question of the letter, the real one, not the one Rook sent, but the one he didn't, the one Marchant had read anyway, or written, or both. It didn't matter anymore, or perhaps it mattered more than ever. Oxford thrives on uncertainty. The official report would speak of heart failure. No mention of the photocopied mural, or the donkey in chalk beneath the stones, or the hymn altered without permission. No mention of the sound heard at dawn, that mournful, braying laugh, human only in its cruelty. I lit a cigarette I didn't want, purely for the motion of it. The smoke curled upwards, catching briefly in the golden blur of the street lamp that had just flickered to life. Somewhere behind me, the chapel bell chimed the half-hour, a tone that managed to sound both sacred and indifferent. I thought of the inscription in the archive file, the one someone had tried to erase, handled internally. Yes, that sounded about right. A curtain twitched in a far window. A cat moved along a ledge like an unanswered question. I sat on the edge of the stone bench near the east wall, the cold seeping into my coat, but not enough to drive me inside. The crossword clue still lingered. Beast of burden with borrowed voice, 6. I had circled it once. Tonight I wrote the answer in the air with my finger, watching it vanish as quickly as I traced it. silent, a trick, of course. A word that contains nothing but noise withheld. Behind me, the door to the porter's lodge creaked open. McGrath stepped out, nodded once, and said nothing, then disappeared again. I finished the cigarette. The light drained from the sky, the quad exhaled, and in that long last hush before night, I thought, perhaps nothing was solved, but something had stopped